The truth about my life wasn't written on a legal document. It wasn't stamped, filed, or signed in blue ink on page 4. The truth about my life was found in a hospital room on the 6th floor of St. Mary's Memorial, about an hour and a half from the house I'd built for a man who'd never once asked me what I wanted. It was discovered on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, while the leaves were turning outside the window and my stepmother, Evelyn, sat beside me holding my hand like she was afraid I'd float away. I was 36 years old. I had a construction company that employed 57 people. I'd spent the last 8 years of my life pouring every cent, every hour, every scrap of my identity into making something solid, something that would last, something that could hold people up. And I had just found out that my entire life had been built on a lie so deep and so old that I couldn't even see the bottom of it. The cancer was stage 3 when they caught it. Not mine, my father's. He'd been hiding it for months, maybe longer. The way he hid everything that made him feel weak or vulnerable or less than the man he'd spent his entire life pretending to be. My father, Daniel, was the kind of man who built skyscrapers with his bare hands and never once asked for a break. He'd started his construction company from nothing, a pickup truck and a toolbox, the way men of his generation did. He'd built a reputation, a fortune, a legacy. And he'd spent my entire childhood teaching me that strength meant never letting anyone see you bleed. He failed at that lesson. I saw him bleed plenty. I just never knew how deep it went until the doctors told us the cancer had spread and that the only thing left to do was make him comfortable. Evelyn called me at the job site. I was standing on the 3rd floor of a high-rise we were framing downtown, my hard hat tucked under my arm, and I remember looking out at the city skyline and thinking about how small everything looked from up there, how fragile, how easy it was to knock down a wall and rebuild it. She was crying before I even said hello. That's the thing about stepmothers, I guess. When they're the only real mother you've ever had, and they're crying, you know something is wrong in a way that can't be fixed with a hammer and a nail. I drove to the hospital that afternoon and I walked into his room and I saw him, this man who had always been so large and so loud and so impossible to ignore, reduced to a bed and a blanket and a series of beeping machines that tracked the slow unraveling of his body. He smiled when he saw me. That was the worst part. He smiled like he was happy to see me, like I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. And I knew, in that moment, that he was going to leave this world without ever telling me the truth. His name was Daniel. He was 72 years old, and he had a construction empire worth tens of millions, and he was dying, and his only son, his only child, the person he'd raised to take over everything, was about to inherit the thing I'd never wanted in the first place. But I was about to find out that the inheritance I'd been dreading for 30 years wasn't even mine to claim. It was just the first layer of a deception that ran so deep it had shaped every single choice I'd ever made. Let me back up. I know I started in the middle, the way people do, when they're trying to tell you the most important story of their life, and they can't quite figure out where the beginning actually is. The beginning is my mother. Not Evelyn. My real mother. Sheila. She left when I was 6 years old. I don't remember much about her, just the smell of her perfume and the way she used to laugh when I said something funny, like I was the most entertaining person she'd ever met. She left in the middle of the night. I woke up and she was gone, and my father told me she'd had to go away for a while, and I believed him because I was 6 and I didn't know any better. He never told me where she went. He never told me why she left. He just said she wasn't coming back and that we were going to be fine, just the two of us. And I believed him because I had no choice. I grew up in the shadow of my father's company. It was called Palmer Construction, a name I'd heard 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts, always with the same level of reverence. My father was a legend in our town. People would point at buildings and tell me their stories, who'd built them, who'd poured the foundation, who'd framed the walls. My father's name was on half the buildings in the city, and my father's name was on my birth certificate, and I spent my entire childhood trying to figure out how to be worthy of a name that meant so much to everyone else. But my father didn't want me in the business. That was the cruel joke of it. He'd built an empire, and he refused to let me touch it. He sent me to college for engineering, paid for everything himself, but he never once invited me to the job site. He never once showed me the plans. He treated me like I was a visitor, a guest, someone who'd been allowed into the family by accident and would never truly belong. I spent my 20s trying to earn his approval. I did everything he asked. I stayed out of trouble. I got good grades. I worked for other construction companies, small ones that didn't have his name on the door because he said I needed to learn the business from the ground up. I did everything he asked, and he still never looked at me the way he looked at other people. Like I was his son. Like I was his legacy. Like I was anything at all. It wasn't until I was 30 that I finally confronted him. I walked into his office on a Friday afternoon, the same office he'd had for 40 years, the one with the mahogany desk and the framed photos of buildings he'd built and the American flag in the corner, and I asked him why he was so determined to keep me out. He looked at me for a long moment. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just said, "You're not ready, Noah. You have to earn it." I asked him what else I could possibly do to earn it. I'd spent my whole life trying. And he told me something that broke my heart in a way I didn't even understand until years later. "You're not like me," he said. "You're too soft. You care too much about people. You think a construction company is about making friends. It's not. It's about making money. And if you don't understand that, you'll never run this place." I walked out of that office and I didn't speak to him for 2 years. I started my own company. A small one, a framing crew. I built it from the ground up, the way he'd built his. I hired good people. I paid them well. I showed up to every job site, every morning, without fail. I built a reputation for quality and reliability, the same reputation he'd built. And I never once asked him for help. He told me I couldn't do it. He told me I was too soft. And I spent every day of the next 8 years proving him wrong. The business grew. I went from a framing crew to a full-service construction company. I had 57 employees. I had contracts all over the state. I was making money, real money, the kind of money that changes your life. And I still couldn't get my father to look at me with anything other than disappointment. That's the part one don't think anyone ever understands about being the golden child who was never actually golden. The thing you're working for isn't the money or the success or the approval of strangers. It's the love of the one person who is supposed to give it to you for free. I never got that. I got distance and silence and the occasional compliment that felt like a crumb from a table I'd never been invited to sit at. When Evelyn called me from the hospital and told me my father had months to live, I felt 2 things at once. Grief, real and heavy and complicated. And something else. Something that looked a lot like relief. I'd been waiting my whole life for his approval. And now the wait was over. Now the final verdict would be delivered in a will, and I could finally stop trying. I didn't know, at the time, that the will wasn't the end of a story. I didn't know it was just the beginning. I didn't know that the man I'd spent my entire life trying to impress had been hiding a secret so big it would rewrite every memory I had, and that the real inheritance wasn't the company he'd never let me touch. It was the truth he'd been too afraid to tell me. The truth about my mother. The truth about why she left. The truth about who I really was. And the truth about the brother I never knew existed. I'm going to tell you the rest of the story now, and I want you to understand that none of it happened the way you're expecting. There was no family dinner with perfect china. There was no house with a broken latch. There was no handwritten ledger of secret payments. This was something else entirely. Something quieter and more devastating, because the person who'd been betrayed the most wasn't even aware of the betrayal for 30 years. My father died on a Thursday. I was there when he went. Evelyn was there, too, holding his other hand, the way she'd held mine in that hospital room all those months ago. He looked at me right before the end. He opened his eyes and he looked at me, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Guilt. Or maybe it was regret. Or maybe it was just the kind of fear that comes when you realize you're about to leave this world with all your secrets intact. He tried to say something. His lips moved, but no sound came out. And then he was gone. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect for a man like Daniel Palmer. Hundreds of people. Flowers everywhere. Eulogies that talked about his strength, his vision, his legacy. I sat in the front row and listened to strangers talk about a man I barely recognized, a man who'd been a myth to everyone but a riddle to me. I didn't cry at the funeral. I felt like I should have, but the tears wouldn't come. There was just this hollow space in my chest where grief should have been, and I didn't know what to do with it. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Evelyn was the executor, the way she'd been for everything in my father's life. She was his second wife, his third, actually, depending on how you counted. My real mother, Sheila, was the first. Then there was a woman named Margaret who'd lasted 3 years in the 80s. Then Evelyn, who'd been around for 25 years, long enough to become the only real mother I'd ever known. The will was read in a lawyer's office downtown, the same office my father had used for 40 years. I walked in wearing a suit I'd bought for the occasion, and I sat down across from a mahogany desk the size of a small car, and I waited for the news I'd been dreading my entire life. The lawyer was a man named Gerald, a thin, nervous man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that sounded like he'd been swallowing gravel his whole life. He opened the will and started reading, and I felt like I was watching myself from a great distance, like none of this was really happening to me. The company, Palmer Construction, was to be divided. The majority share, 51%, was going to my brother. My brother. I didn't have a brother. I looked at Gerald, and I waited for him to correct himself, to apologize, to say he'd made a mistake. He didn't. He kept reading. 25% was going to Evelyn. The remaining 24% was going to me. I was the minority shareholder in a company I'd spent my entire life trying to earn. I was the afterthought, the leftover, the one they threw a bone to so I couldn't sue. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the brother who'd been given everything I'd never been allowed to touch. I asked Gerald who this person was. I demanded to know, and Gerald, in his thin, nervous voice, told me the truth. My father had a son before me, a son from a woman he'd been involved with in his 20s, long before he met my mother. The woman had died, and my father had been awarded custody of the child, but he'd never claimed him. He'd never acknowledged him. He'd given the boy a different last name and paid child support through a private account and told no one, not even my mother, that he had a son. That son's name was Julian. Julian had grown up in the same town I'd grown up in, just a few miles away, and he'd never known who his real father was. Not until a few years ago, when my father had reached out and made a confession. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just stared at Gerald and waited for him to tell me this was all a joke, a terrible misunderstanding, something that could be fixed with a few phone calls. But Gerald didn't smile. He just kept talking like he was reading a grocery list about how Julian had been brought into the fold quietly, secretly, a few years before my father's death. About how my father had been training him to take over the company. About how my father had finally found the son he'd always wanted, the son who wasn't too soft, the son who understood that business was about money and not friendship, the son who wasn't me. Evelyn was sitting beside me, and I looked at her, and I could see she'd known. She'd known about Julian. She'd known for years. She'd helped my father keep the secret. She'd helped him build a world where his firstborn son was a ghost, where his second-born son was a disappointment, where the woman he'd abandoned and the child he'd hidden and the life he'd pretended to have were all part of the same elaborate fiction. I stood up. I don't remember making the decision. My body just moved and I was on my feet and I was walking toward the door. Evelyn called my name. I didn't stop. I walked out of that office and I walked down the street and I kept walking until I found a bench in a small park and I sat down and I stared at nothing for a long, long time. That's where I met Julian for the first time. He found me there a few hours later. I don't know how. Maybe Evelyn told him where I was. Maybe he'd just guessed. He sat down beside me on the bench and he didn't say anything for a long time. We just sat there, two strangers who shared a father, two strangers who'd been pitted against each other without even knowing it. He was younger than me, I realized. Not by much, maybe a year or two. But he had the same eyes, the same set of the jaw, the same way of holding his shoulders that I'd recognized in my father my whole life. He looked like us. He looked like he belonged. And all I could think was, why? Why had my father never told me? Why had he let me spend 30 years believing I was his only child, his only hope, the only person who could carry his name into the future? Why had he let me fight so hard for something he never intended to give me? Julian was the one who broke the silence. He said he'd never wanted any of this. He said my father had reached out to him a few years ago, told him the truth, and offered to bring him into the business. He'd said no at first. He'd been angry the way I was angry now. But my father had worn him down, the way he wore everyone down, and eventually Julian had agreed. He'd been working at Palmer Construction for 2 years, learning the business, preparing to take over. He'd never been told I was in the picture. My father had never mentioned me, not once. Julian thought he was the only son. He thought I was the fiction. And we both sat there on that park bench, staring at the same impossible truth, realizing that we'd both been lied to by the same man. That's the thing about secrets. They don't just hurt the people they're kept from. They hurt everyone they touch. They spread like poison, and they destroy everything in their path. My father had thought he was protecting us. He thought that hiding Julian would make my life easier, cleaner, simpler. He thought that by keeping me at arm's length, by never letting me get too close to the business, he was preparing me for a life that didn't revolve around him. He'd been wrong. He'd been so wrong. And now he was dead, and the truth was out, and I was sitting on a park bench with a brother I'd never known I had, and neither of us knew what to do next. I'll be honest with you. I was angry, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. I was angry at my father for lying to me. I was angry at Evelyn for keeping the secret. I was angry at Julian for existing, for being the answer to a question I never thought to ask. But most of all, I was angry at myself for believing, for trusting, for spending my entire life trying to earn the love of a man who'd never been capable of giving it. The days that followed were a blur. I went back to work. I threw myself into my own company, the one I'd built from nothing, the one my father had never believed in. I told myself that none of this mattered, that the inheritance was just money and I didn't need it, that I had my own life, my own success, my own legacy to build. But I couldn't stop thinking about Julian. I couldn't stop wondering what it would have been like to grow up with a brother, to have someone to share the weight of my father's expectations, the burden of his love, the absence of my mother. I couldn't stop wondering about the life I might have had if I'd known the truth earlier. And I couldn't stop wondering why my mother had left. That was the question that gnawed at me. Why had Sheila walked out in the middle of the night and never come back? Had she known about Julian? Had she found out and been so betrayed that she couldn't stay? Or had she left for some other reason, some reason my father had taken to his grave? Evelyn called me a week after the funeral. She wanted to talk. She said there were things I needed to know. I agreed to meet her, but I didn't want to go to the house. I didn't want to sit in that room full of trophies and memories and lies. I met her at a coffee shop downtown. She looked older than she had a few months ago. Grief had carved lines into her face, made her smaller somehow. She ordered tea even though she never drank tea, and I watched her stir it and stare at the steam like it held answers to questions she'd been too afraid to ask. "Your father wanted to tell you," she said. "He was going to tell you when you were older. But the years passed and he kept putting it off, and eventually it was too late." I didn't say anything. I just waited.
"He was ashamed," she said.
He was ashamed of what he'd done. He'd been young and stupid, and he'd abandoned a woman and a child, and he'd never forgiven himself. He thought if he told you, you'd see him differently. You'd hate him. He couldn't bear that. I still didn't say anything. "He loved you," she said. "He loved you so much. He just didn't know how to show it. He was afraid of getting too close. He was afraid of losing you the way he'd lost his first child." "He didn't lose him," I said. "He gave him up. He hid him. He made him a secret." Evelyn nodded. She couldn't argue with that. "He was a complicated man," she said. "He had demons. He made mistakes. But he wanted you to be okay, Noah. That was all he ever wanted." I didn't believe her. I wanted to, but I couldn't. All I could think about was the empty space in my chest, the space that was supposed to be filled with grief and love and forgiveness, and how all of it had been hollowed out by a secret I should have known 30 years ago. I told her I needed time. I told her I couldn't think about my father or the company or the inheritance or Julian or any of it. I told her I needed to process everything, and I walked out of the coffee shop and I didn't look back. The next few months were hard. I threw myself into my work. I hired more employees. I took on bigger projects. I worked 16-hour days because I couldn't sleep, because every time I closed my eyes I saw my father's face, and every time I saw his face, I felt the same cold wave of grief and anger and confusion that had been with me since the day I read the will. Julian called me a few times. I let the calls go to voicemail. I told myself I didn't owe him anything. I told myself he was just a stranger, someone I'd never asked for, someone I'd never wanted. I told myself I could just walk away and forget the whole thing ever happened. But I couldn't. He called again, and eventually I answered. He was different on the phone.
Softer.
More vulnerable. He told me he understood why I was angry. He told me he'd been angry too when my father first reached out. He told me he'd struggled with the same questions, the same doubts, the same sense of betrayal. He told me he'd been looking for a connection his whole life, and he'd found it in the worst possible way.
I didn't know what to say to that.
So I told him the truth. I told him I'd spent my whole life trying to earn my father's approval, and I'd never gotten it. I told him I'd built my own company to prove I was good enough, and I still wasn't. I told him that the inheritance, the company, the money, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that my father had never believed in me. "He believed in you more than you know," Julian said.
"He told me about you. He talked about you all the time. He was so proud of you, Noah."
"He just never knew how to tell you." I almost hung up. I almost ended the call right there because it was too much. The idea that my father had been proud of me, that he talked about me to someone else, that he'd loved me in his own broken way, and I'd never known. It was too much to bear. But I stayed on the line, and we talked for another hour, and then another. And by the end of it, I realized that Julian wasn't my enemy. He was just another victim, another person who'd been hurt by the same secret, another person who'd been looking for a family and found only ghosts. The inheritance was complicated. I won't bore you with the details. There were lawyers and meetings and negotiations. It took 6 months before we reached a settlement. In the end, I sold my share of Palmer Construction to Julian. He was running the company now the way my father had always wanted. And I walked away with enough money to change my life, but not enough to fix everything that had been broken. That part still hurts. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. I built a company from nothing, and I sold it to a brother I'd never known, and I walked away from my father's legacy because I couldn't bear to be part of it anymore. That's the truth. Julian and I talk now. We try. We meet for coffee sometimes, in the same coffee shop where Evelyn told me the truth. We talk about our lives, our jobs, our families. We talk about my father, the way people talk about someone they've lost, with a mixture of anger and sadness and love. We talk about the emptiness, the confusion, the sense of betrayal that's never going to fully go away. It's hard. It's always going to be hard. But it's better than the silence, better than the secrets, better than the distance that kept us apart for so long. I think about my mother sometimes. I wonder what happened to her. I wonder if she's alive, if she's happy, if she ever thinks about the son she left behind. I've never tried to find her. I'm not ready. Maybe I'll never be ready. Some wounds are too deep to heal completely. They just become part of you. The way my father's death and the discovery of my brother and the loss of my inheritance have become part of me. I don't talk about this story often. It's too personal, too raw, too full of emotions that don't have neat resolutions or happy endings. But I'm telling you now because I think someone needs to hear it. Someone out there is carrying a secret of their own. Someone out there is waiting for closure that might never come. Someone out there is trying to forgive a parent who hurt them in ways they'll never fully understand. I want you to know it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to take as long as you need to process everything. Grief doesn't have a timeline. Healing doesn't have a deadline. And sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are the ones who loved us the most in the only way they knew how. My father was wrong about a lot of things. He was wrong to keep secrets.
He was wrong to lie.
He was wrong to treat me like I wasn't good enough. But he was right about one thing. He said I was too soft. He said I cared too much about people. He said I'd never run his company because I wasn't ruthless enough.
He was wrong about that, too.
I'm soft. I do care about people. And that's why I walked away. Because caring about people isn't a weakness. It's the only thing that makes any of this worth it. It's the only thing that makes the pain bearable. It's the only thing that lets you look at someone who hurt you and say, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I still think about that day in the hospital. I think about the way he looked at me right before he died. I think about the words he couldn't say, the apology that never came, the truth that died with him. I think about the brother I never knew, and the mother I'll never find, and the life I could have had if things had been different. And then I think about the life I have now, the company I built, the people I love, the peace I've found in accepting that some things are beyond my control. That's what I want you to take away from this. Not the anger, not the sadness, not the betrayal, the peace. The knowledge that you can survive the hardest things life throws at you, that you can find a way to keep going, even when everything feels broken, that you can forgive, even when forgiveness feels impossible, that you can build something new out of the ashes of everything you've lost. That's what my father never understood. He thought strength was about never showing weakness. He thought power was about never being vulnerable. He thought love was about keeping people at a distance so they couldn't hurt you. He was wrong. Strength is about letting yourself feel everything and still standing. Power is about asking for help when you need it. Love is about letting people in, even when you're afraid. I learned that lesson too late to save my relationship with my father, but I learned it in time to save myself. I learned it in time to build a new relationship with my brother, A better one. One based on truth and honesty, and the kind of trust that doesn't require secrets. I learned it in time to become the person I was always meant to be. And that's the inheritance that matters. Not the company, not the money, not the approval I never got. The person I became in spite of all of it. That's the story I'm telling today. It's not neat. It's not clean. It doesn't have a happy ending in the way we usually think about happy endings. It's messy and complicated and full of grief. But it's mine. And I'm finally okay with that. If you've ever been the person who wasn't chosen, the person who wasn't good enough, the person who had to build their own life because no one would give them one, I see you. I know how hard it is. I know how lonely it can be. I know how tempting it is to give up.
Don't. Keep going. Keep building.
Keep believing in yourself, even when no one else does. Because one day, you'll look back and realize that the life you built for yourself is the one that matters. The one that's yours. The one that no one can take away. I'm not angry at my father anymore. I'm not angry at Evelyn. I'm not even angry at Julian. I'm just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of secrets that weren't mine to keep. Tired of letting the past define my future. Tired of being the person who always gets left behind. I'm letting it go. All of it. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, the questions that will never be answered, the apologies I'll never get. I'm letting it all go, and I'm finally allowing myself to move forward. That's the real meaning of freedom, I think. Not revenge. Not justice. Not winning the fight. Walking away. Choosing peace. Choosing yourself. Choosing the life you want instead of the life you were given. I hope you find that peace, too. I hope you find a way to let go of whatever's been holding you back. And I hope you remember on the hard days that you're stronger than you know, that you can survive anything, that you're worth more than the secrets that have been kept from you. That's the truth I learned in the worst way possible. And that's the truth I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. This is Noah Palmer, and this has been my story. Subscribe if you want to hear more. Drop a comment if it meant something to you. The sequel is coming, and it's darker.